Strings of Malice, Book 1, Snowflake in an Alley, An Old Mother Nonsense Story. Chapter 8, A Babe for Cookies. Glorital, 22nd Ikrit. The morning was crisp, and only the sounds of small beasts lingered in the air. Roused by birdsong carried on gentle wind, Lunreth turned over to return to sleep, only to discover his bed empty. No sister and no baby. Adrenaline flooded through him in an instant, and it would have persisted too if the wind hadn't changed and chirps turned to the low crackling of a fire and hushed mutterings. The man listened for a tense moment before letting out a long, slow breath and pulled himself from his temporary bed. Not more than a few meters from the tent, Irinka sat stoking the small fire she had brought back to life. The babe was swaddled in her own blanket, but seemed content enough to drown in it, while the mouse curled her arm around the back of its head to hold the bottle. He watched with amusement for a while, until the baby had finished its breakfast and burped softly.
"Oh, you are a disgusting thing,"
Irinka scolded it, setting down her stick into the coals to properly handle it into a more comfortable position for herself. The youngling made a quiet noise of contentedness, and the girl snapped her gaze away from it, though her eyes drifted back soon enough.
"Don't be like that,"
Irinka grumbled, more to herself than the babe in her arms.
"You're going to be witch's gruel soon enough. No point in feeling sorry for you."
Hugging it a little tighter to her belied her words.
"Some of us are just dealt a bad deck. At least you won't remember any of this."
Lunreth knew she was right. No use hoping her prediction would turn out to be false. He pulled on his jacket and stepped out of the tent, offered her a small morning wave, and started making them something warm to drink. They almost made breakfast, but the new day had brought with it a thin sense of urgency for Lunreth. Irinka seemed to feel it too. Last night, the fear had been about outcomes. Today, what if the chance was gone? This morning, the hike up the hill was an eager and easy one. Unnoticed in the shadows of evening, yet impossible to miss now, a path of yellow and tan riverstones led the way.
I thought it would be..."
Irinka hummed once they stood outside, only a small gate and a garden of poisonous herbs separating them from a blue front door, and the kind of cottage one might see in idyllic illustrations.
"Just creepier,"
she admitted. Lunreth signed a word that they had practiced more than once since her declaration to go with him. Trap. She frowned, but squared her shoulders and nodded determinedly.
"After you."
Yet she still slipped her hand into his, and he was grateful for it, because he clutched back. His nerves were on edge with all manner of emotions, hope certainly not the least of them. She used her free hand to unlatch the gate, and together they walked through it, climbed the 3 stone steps, and faced up to the blue door. It opened before either could knock, and a thin voice called from inside.
"Come in. I'll be out in a minute."
The pair stood awkwardly in the doorway until a huff sounded from somewhere within. The wind whistled behind them, and the next time they blinked, they were both inside and sitting down in a couple of embroidered chairs before a recently lit hearth, a tumbler of amber liquid in Irinka's hands, and a cup of tea in Lunreth's. The baby that was still strapped to Lunreth's chest made a sleepy, disgruntled sound. When their eyes met across the small tea table, they both couldn't help but smile at the surprise. The magic had not been wrong in their beverages of choice. Irinka hummed happily as the first sip sent a familiar burn down her throat to settle in her chest. All manner of jarred creatures watched them from the mantel, as she tipped the rest of the glass's contents back. It immediately refilled. Lunreth sipped his tea cautiously. His book had explained that, while one should always be cautious about the hospitality of witches, to prove an ungrateful guest was bound to have you swiftly kicked out. He let his gaze travel up the hearth. The mantel was carved with intricate filigree, and a portrait of 4 women, surreally beautiful, hung above it. He was drawn to the painting. Irinka, alternatively, fascinated with the various herbs and thuribles hanging to make the ceiling low. Lunreth couldn't tear his eyes away from the portrait. 3 of the women were sitting and lounging across an ornate sofa. An olive green-skinned girl, barely a woman, sat off to the left, facing the painter with a blank, if slightly worried expression. A middle-aged woman sat on the right, though seemed distracted, as she dangled a squirming mouse above a young woman's laughing face, as she lay with her head in the older woman's lap. The 2 interacting had 12 arms between them, while the girl off to the side had 4. Yet none of them captured and kept the Jinrin's attention. Standing behind the 3, ordinary 2 arms crossed over the back of the settee, and a warm, soft smile on plump red lips that matched her hair, Lunreth recognized her. A melody he could never hum but never forget phantomed around him with his heartbeat, filling the space with drums from half a lifetime ago. What on cedar was she doing here? The sound of shuffling footsteps finally pulled Lunreth from his confused trance. An older lady walked out of what they could only assume to be the kitchen, if the plate of cookies she brought with her were any indication. She could be described as neither plump nor frail, neither ugly nor pretty, simply old. Irinka spoke up, and Lunreth wondered again why he hadn't been more insistent that she stay behind.
You don't look like a witch,
she said bluntly. The presumed Granny Cracklecreep raised an eyebrow at her.
And what did you expect a witch to look like, dear?
The girl frowned.
Looks can be deceiving, girl.
Granny smiled, showing off her razor teeth.
You don't look like a princess.
Irinka blanched, taken aback by the tease.
A what?
The woman smirked, but before the girl could say anything else, a loud, sharp, short whistle shattered any thread the conversation may have taken. Lunreth glared at his sister, and deliberately set his teacup aside before bringing a hand up to rub his fingers together. Irinka shrank back into her seat. For one, she had never heard Lunreth so much as wheeze before, let alone make such a loud sound. 2, he had never looked at her so coldly, so disappointedly. And 3, the words in his hands terrified her. Trap. It'll cost you something. The old woman watched the exchange, with the same smirk slowly creeping back onto her indigo face and making the deep wrinkles around her eyes crinkle with amusement.
Clever boy,
she hummed, voice more conniving now than playful.
Though you are honestly overreacting. I would have only asked for something small.
Her dark eyes flickered down to the baby, still sleeping on his chest. The firelight caught them just right, and there was a flash of yellow behind the illusion of green. Lunreth would deal with it in a moment. For now he stood, and the infant grumbled unhappily as it was moved about. Granny watched him closely, but not with concern, when he stepped around the table to come closer to her. He held out the baby to her and tapped his boots together gently. He did it again when the woman made no move to take the babe. Irinka found her voice again, even if it was strained and scared.
The shoemaker in town asked us to bring her to you, Granny Cracklecreep. Ali something or other.
The woman frowned, seemingly in confusion, before she outright laughed.
Ah, yes. You have to forgive me. It isn't easy to remember such things when you get to my age.
Irinka gasped when Granny reached out to take the baby with 2 arms, and another 4 unfolded eagerly from behind her back. one to shift the plate of cookies out of the way and into her brother's hands in exchange for the babe. Lunreth didn't so much as flinch at the sight. One arm picked up the basket of milk they still had left, while the other two worked along with a short spell to clean up and wake the child properly. From where she sat, Irinka could see the baby's eyes open and focus on the woman, really seeing for the first time. It began fussing softly. The mouse supposed she would too if Granny's was the first face she ever saw.
Oh, don't I know it?
Granny cooed to the little girl, ignoring her two guests now in favor of the infant.
It's going to be such a hassle, since Mommy Dearest didn't keep up her end of the bargain.
One hand came up to tickle the child's belly, and it giggled, grabbing for the woman's bony finger.
No matter, you'll just have to pay it off,
she continued cooing, as she turned and carried the baby out of the room. Irinka was about to say something when the plate of cookies was thrust at her. She looked up at her brother and tentatively took one when he insisted sternly. He took her seat again and nodded, grabbing one for himself too. They really shouldn't have skipped breakfast. The mouse followed her brother's lead and nibbled at the treat meekly. Finally, Lunreth sighed and signed over his chest. Sorry.
You were scary.
Irinka whispered in return.
Thanks, Boo.
He nodded, and they waited.